Picture this. You're 6 months pregnant, living in a $20 million mansion, married to one of the most powerful men in America. Life is perfect. Then one morning, police officers are handcuffing you in your own driveway while cameras flash and your billionaire husband watches from the window, convinced you've stolen a $5 million family heirloom. But here's what will shock you. The real thief isn't some random criminal. It's someone you trusted completely. Someone who smiled at your baby shower, who promised to protect you, who had access to everything in your life. Sarah Mitchell thought she knew who her enemies were. She was dead wrong. And by the time she figured out the truth, she was giving birth in a prison cell, branded as a criminal, and watching the woman who destroyed her life raise her stolen child. This isn't just a story about betrayal. This is about how the people closest to us can become our greatest enemies, and how sometimes the most dangerous prison isn't made of bars and concrete. It's made of lies, manipulation, and the trust we place in the wrong people. What happened to Sarah will make you question everyone in your life. Because the truth is, the person planning your destruction might be sitting right next to you, wearing a smile. Sarah Mitchell screamed as another contraction ripped through her body. The prison infirmary was cold, sterile, nothing like the birthing suite she had planned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she gripped the metal bed rails. "My husband did this to me," she gasped between breaths, tears streaming down her face. The prison doctor barely looked up from his clipboard. To him, she was just another inmate having a baby, but Sarah Mitchell was no ordinary prisoner. 6 months earlier, she had been living in a $20 million mansion in Beverly Hills. She had been married to Marcus Blackstone, the tech billionaire, whose face graced magazine covers worldwide. She had been pregnant, happy, and completely unaware that her fairy tale was about to become a nightmare. The flashback began on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah stood in the marble bathroom of their mansion, staring at the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hands. After 2 years of trying, it had finally happened. She was going to be a mother. Marcus had been in his home office, surrounded by multiple monitors displaying stock prices and business reports. When Sarah knocked on the heavy oak door, he barely looked up. "Marcus, I have news," she said, her voice barely containing her excitement. He glanced at her, then back at his screens. "Can it wait? The Tokyo markets are opening and I need to... I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Marcus froze, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. Slowly, he turned in his chair, his dark eyes focusing on her with laser intensity. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice strangely flat. Sarah nodded, holding up the test. "I took 3 of them. We're going to have a baby, Marcus." What happened next should have been joy. Instead, Marcus stood up and walked to her with the same calculating expression he wore during hostile takeovers. He placed his hands on her shoulders, but his grip felt more possessive than loving. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to be more careful now, more secure." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed the feeling away. Marcus was just being protective. That was normal, right? Rich men had to worry about security threats, kidnapping attempts, extortion. She understood that. But over the following weeks, Marcus's protection became suffocating. He installed new cameras throughout their home, claiming they were for safety. He hired a personal security detail to accompany Sarah everywhere, even to her doctor appointments. Most concerning of all, he brought in Victoria Sterling. Victoria was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall, angular, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, she carried herself like a predator. A former FBI agent, she now headed Blackstone Industries' security division. But her presence in their home felt invasive, territorial. "For your safety, Mrs. Blackstone," Victoria said during their first meeting, her pale blue eyes scanning Sarah like a threat assessment. "Mr. Blackstone wants to ensure nothing happens to you or the baby." Sarah tried to smile. "I appreciate the concern, but isn't this a bit much? I'm just going to the grocery store." Victoria's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "You'd be surprised how dangerous grocery stores can be for someone in your position." That night, Sarah found Marcus in his study, poring over architectural plans for what looked like a panic room. "Marcus, we need to talk about Victoria," Sarah said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "What about her?" he asked without looking up. "She makes me uncomfortable. I feel like she's watching my every move." Marcus finally raised his eyes to meet hers. She's protecting you, protecting our child. I would think you'd be grateful. I am grateful, but nothing, Sarah. You don't understand the world I live in, the threats I face daily, the enemies who would love nothing more than to hurt what's mine. The word mine hit Sarah like a slap. Not ours. Not us. Mine. I'm not a possession, Marcus. His expression hardened. No, but you are my responsibility, and I take my responsibilities very seriously. That night, lying in their king-size bed, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered when her husband had become a stranger. The man who had courted her with poetry and surprise picnic lunches had been replaced by someone cold, calculating, and increasingly paranoid. She had met Marcus 3 years earlier at a journalism conference in San Francisco. She had been covering tech industry corruption for the Los Angeles Times, and he had been the keynote speaker. Afterward, he had approached her at the hotel bar. "You asked some tough questions in there?" he had said, sliding onto the bar stool beside her. "That's my job," she had replied, not impressed by his designer suit or confident demeanor. "I respect that. Most reporters just want sound bites. You want the truth." He had been right. Sarah Mitchell had built her career on uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made powerful people. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking questions. Marriage to Marcus had been intoxicating at first. The wealth, the travel, the feeling of being chosen by one of the most powerful men in America. But power, Sarah was learning, could be a prison as much as poverty. As she felt the baby kick inside her, she made a silent promise. Whatever happened, she would protect her child. She would find a way to break free from this golden cage. She had no idea that her prison was about to become very real, very quickly. 3 weeks later, Marcus led Sarah through the mansion to a room she had never seen before. Behind a hidden panel in his study lay a climate-controlled vault that housed his most precious possessions. "I want to show you something," Marcus said, his voice carrying an unusual note of reverence. The vault door was 6 inches of solid steel, secured by both biometric scanners and a traditional combination lock. Inside, the walls were lined with display cases containing artifacts that belonged in museums. Civil War memorabilia, Native American pottery, and in the center case, the crown jewel of Marcus's collection, Abraham Lincoln's personal pocket watch. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, staring at the gold timepiece under its protective glass. The watch was inscribed with Lincoln's initials and dated 1861. "It's worth $5 million, Marcus said, but his tone suggested its value transcended money. "My father spent 20 years tracking it down. It was his dying wish that I continue the collection." Sarah noticed Victoria standing in the doorway, her pale eyes fixed on the watch with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. There was something predatory in that gaze, like a cat watching a canary. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked. Marcus placed his hand on her growing belly. "Because one day, this will all belong to our son. He needs to understand his heritage, his responsibility." Sarah felt a chill. "What if we have a daughter?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "We won't. The Blackstone line has produced sons for 6 generations. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the vault, the watch, and the strange look in Victoria's eyes. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The answer came 2 weeks later. Sarah woke to the sound of shouting from downstairs. She grabbed her robe and hurried toward the commotion, her heart racing. She found Marcus in his study with Victoria and 2 men she didn't recognize, their voices tense with urgency. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked from the doorway. Marcus spun around, his face pale. "Someone broke into the vault. Lincoln's watch is gone." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. The security system was bypassed," Victoria interrupted, her voice clinical and cold. "This was a professional job, someone with inside knowledge." The 2 strangers stepped forward. The older one, a heavy-set man with gray hair, flashed his badge. "Detective Ray Cooper, LAPD. This is my partner, Detective Martinez. We need to ask you some questions, Mrs. Blackstone." "Me? Why me?" Sarah's voice came out as a squeak. Victoria stepped closer, her presence looming and threatening. "The security logs show only 3 people accessed the vault in the past week. Marcus, myself, and you, Mrs. Blackstone." Sarah felt the room spinning. That's ridiculous. I would never. The system doesn't lie, Victoria said smoothly. The biometric scanner recorded your fingerprints and retinal scan at 2:30 a.m. last Tuesday. I was asleep last Tuesday night, Sarah protested, looking desperately at Marcus. Tell them, Marcus, I was right beside you. But Marcus was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. Doubt. Cold, calculating doubt. I took a sleeping pill that night, he said slowly. I was out until morning. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. You don't believe I did this, do you? Marcus didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, Sarah heard her marriage crumbling. Detective Cooper cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackstone, we're going to need to search your personal belongings. With your permission, of course. Of course, Sarah said, her voice hollow. Search whatever you want. I have nothing to hide. Victoria smiled, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the woman looked satisfied, almost triumphant. I'll show you to Mrs. Blackstone's dressing room, Victoria said to the detectives. I'm afraid we'll need to be thorough. As they filed out of the study, Marcus remained behind, staring at the open vault. Sarah approached him cautiously. Marcus, you know I didn't do this. You know me. He turned to face her, and the man she had married was gone. In his place stood a stranger with cold, calculating eyes. Do I, Sarah? Do I really know you? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she was about to learn a terrible truth. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who destroy us. From upstairs came the sound of furniture being moved, drawers being opened, a life being dissected by strangers. Victoria's voice drifted down, professional and helpful, guiding the investigation. Sarah placed her hand on her belly and felt the baby kick, as if sensing her distress. She was 6 months pregnant, standing in a $20 million mansion, surrounded by everything money could buy. And she had never felt more alone in her life. The search took 4 hours. 4 hours of watching strangers rifle through her most personal belongings, while Marcus stood silent and Victoria supervised with barely concealed glee. Sarah sat on the living room couch, her hands folded protectively over her belly, as the sounds of her life being torn apart echoed from upstairs. Detective Cooper had been kind enough to bring her a glass of water, but Detective Martinez kept shooting her suspicious glances. Nothing yet, she heard Victoria call from the master bedroom. But let's be thorough. Check the bathroom, the walk-in closet. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to calm herself. This was all a terrible mistake. They would find nothing because there was nothing to find. She would be vindicated and life would return to normal. Marcus would apologize for doubting her, and they would move forward as a family. Mrs. Blackstone! Sarah opened her eyes to find Detective Cooper standing in front of her, his expression grim. Behind him, Detective Martinez held an evidence bag containing something that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. Lincoln's pocket watch. We found this hidden inside your prenatal vitamin bottle, Detective Cooper said, his voice carefully neutral. Can you explain how it got there? Sarah stared at the watch in the evidence bag, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. That's impossible. I've never seen that before. I mean, I saw it in the vault, but I never touched it. You hid it with our baby's vitamins? Marcus's voice cut through her protests like a knife. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disgust and betrayal. How sick are you, Sarah? I didn't do this. Sarah shot to her feet, swaying slightly from the sudden movement. Someone planted it there. Someone is framing me. Victoria appeared beside Marcus, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that seemed both supportive and possessive. The evidence speaks for itself, Sarah. I'm sorry, but the facts are clear. Facts? Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. The only fact here is that someone put that watch in my vitamins. Marcus, please, you have to believe me. I would never steal from you. I love you. But Marcus had already turned away, his jaw set in a hard line. Detective Cooper, I want to press full charges, grand theft, violation of trust, whatever the maximum penalty is. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. This couldn't be happening. She was 6 months pregnant. She was supposed to be planning nursery colors and picking out baby names, not staring at handcuffs in a police officer's hands. Sarah Mitchell Blackstone, You're under arrest for grand theft, Detective Cooper said, his voice gentle but implacable. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. As Detective Cooper recited her rights, Sarah looked desperately around the room that had been her home for 2 years. The Persian rugs, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, all of it felt like a movie set now, beautiful but fake. Marcus, please, she whispered as they led her toward the front door. Don't let them do this. I'm carrying your child. Marcus finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was complete, utter disappointment. I don't know who you are, he said quietly. I don't think I ever did. The perp walk was a media circus. Someone had tipped off the paparazzi, and they were waiting in force as the police car pulled up to the mansion's front gate. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as Sarah was led to the unmarked car, her hands cuffed behind her back, her pregnant belly prominent beneath her designer maternity dress. Sarah, did you steal from your husband? How much did you take? Are you a gold digger? The questions came like bullets, each one more painful than the last. Sarah kept her head down, trying to shield herself from the humiliation, but there was nowhere to hide. As the police car pulled away, Sarah caught a glimpse of Marcus standing at his study window, Victoria beside him. They were watching her leave, and neither of them looked sad. At the police station, the booking process was a nightmare of fingerprints, mugshots, and invasive questions. The female officer who processed her was professional but cold, treating her like any other criminal despite her obvious pregnancy and distress. Phone call, the officer said, leading Sarah to a bank of payphones in the hallway. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed the only number she could think of. Emma Rodriguez, her former journalism partner and best friend. Emma, it's Sarah. I'm in jail. What? Sarah, what are you talking about? Through tears and broken sentences, Sarah explained everything. The missing watch, the planted evidence, Marcus's betrayal. Emma listened without interruption, and when Sarah finished, there was a long pause. I'll be right there, Emma said finally. Don't say another word to anyone until I arrive with a lawyer. But even as Sarah hung up the phone, she knew it was too late. The damage was done. By morning, her mugshot would be on every news website and gossip blog in America. She would be famous for all the wrong reasons, the pregnant wife who stole from her billionaire husband. As the cell door clanged shut behind her, Sarah sank onto the narrow cot and finally let herself cry. She cried for the life she had lost, for the husband who had abandoned her, and for the child who would be born into a world that already saw his mother as a criminal. She had no idea that this was only the beginning. The real nightmare hadn't even started yet. Outside the jail, Marcus Blackstone was giving a press conference on the steps of Blackstone Industries headquarters. His statement was brief, his voice steady and controlled. I am heartbroken but resolved, he said into the microphone forest. Justice must be served, regardless of personal cost. My wife has betrayed not only me, but the trust of our unborn child. I will cooperate fully with law enforcement to ensure she faces the full consequences of her actions. Victoria stood behind him, her expression appropriately somber. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The trap had been sprung perfectly. Sarah Mitchell Blackstone was exactly where Victoria wanted her. Powerless, discredited, and completely alone. 3 days later, Emma Rodriguez burst into the Los Angeles County Jail visitors room like a force of nature. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in her car, and her brown eyes blazed with righteous fury. They can't do this to you, Emma declared, as she slammed a thick folder onto the metal table between them. I've been digging into the security system, and there are anomalies everywhere. Sarah looked up from her hands, hope flickering in her chest for the first time since her arrest. Emma had been her partner at the Los Angeles Times for 3 years, and if anyone could uncover the truth, it was her. What kind of anomalies? Sarah asked, leaning forward despite the heavy weight of her shackles. Emma opened the folder, revealing printouts of computer code, security logs, and technical diagrams. The biometric system that supposedly recorded your entry into the vault? It was accessed remotely 3 times in the week before the theft. Someone with high-level administrative privileges was in that system, Sarah. Who has that kind of access? According to the system documentation, only 3 people. Marcus, the head of IT, and Victoria Sterling. Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Victoria, she was the one who found the watch in my vitamins. She guided the entire search. Emma nodded grimly. And get this, I pulled her FBI personnel file through some old contacts. Victoria Sterling has a background in digital forensics and cybersecurity. She would know exactly how to manipulate a biometric system. For the first time in days, Sarah felt like she could breathe. This proves I was framed. We can take this to my lawyer. Emma's expression darkened. About that, your court-appointed attorney, David Chen, called me this morning. He's dropping your case. What? Why? He said he received a better offer from another client. But Sarah, I did some digging. Chen's practice was struggling financially, and suddenly this week, he paid off 3 months of back rent and bought a new car. Sarah felt the hope drain from her chest like water from a broken dam. Someone bought him off. That's what I think. But don't worry, I'm already working on getting you new representation. There's a firm in downtown LA that specializes in white-collar defense. They're expensive, but they're good. Before Sarah could respond, a guard appeared at the door. Time's up. As Emma gathered her papers, she leaned across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. I'm going to prove your innocence. I promise you that. My new podcast, Truth Seekers, launches next week, and your case is going to be the first story. Watching Emma leave, Sarah felt a complex mix of gratitude and fear. Emma was brilliant and tenacious, but she was also going up against some of the most powerful people in Los Angeles. Sarah just prayed her friend wouldn't become another casualty in this nightmare. That night, Sarah lay on her narrow jail cot and tried to feel the baby moving inside her. At 6.5 months, the kicks were strong and frequent, but tonight, everything was still. She pressed her hands to her belly, willing her child to respond. Please be okay, she whispered into the darkness. Please hold on until Mommy can get us out of here. The next morning brought devastating news. Emma's promised lawyer had also withdrawn from the case, citing scheduling conflicts. The pattern was clear. Someone with serious money and influence was ensuring Sarah remained defenseless. But Emma wasn't giving up. She began investigating Victoria Sterling's background more deeply, and what she found was disturbing. Victoria had left the FBI under mysterious circumstances 5 years earlier. Her final case had involved financial fraud, and according to Emma's source, there had been questions about missing evidence. More importantly, Emma discovered that Victoria had been working for Marcus Blackstone for exactly 5 years, since immediately after leaving the FBI. It's too coincidental, Emma explained during their next visit. She leaves law enforcement under a cloud and immediately goes to work for one of the richest men in America. I think Victoria Sterling has been planning this for a long time. Sarah tried to process this information, but the stress and poor jail conditions were taking their toll. She was losing weight despite being pregnant, and the constant fear was affecting her ability to think clearly. There's something else, Emma continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I've been tracking financial records, and Victoria has been making some interesting purchases, high-end surveillance equipment, computer hardware, and get this, she rented a storage unit in Burbank 6 months ago. What's in the storage unit? I don't know yet, but I'm working on it. Sarah, I think Victoria has been planning to frame you since before your pregnancy was announced. This whole thing is a setup. As Emma spoke, Sarah became aware that they were being watched. At a table across the visitor's room, a woman with short blonde hair was pretending to read a magazine while clearly listening to their conversation. Emma, Sarah whispered, nodding slightly toward the woman. We're being monitored. Emma glanced over and swore under her breath. This is deeper than I thought. They're not just framing you. They're actively working to prevent your defense. The visit ended abruptly when the watching woman stood up and spoke quietly to a guard. Suddenly, Sarah was being led back to her cell while Emma was asked to leave immediately. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her cell seemed threatening, every sound in the hallway potentially dangerous. If Victoria was willing to monitor jail visits and buy off lawyers, what else was she capable of? The answer came 2 days later in the form of devastating news. Emma Rodriguez had been found dead in her apartment, apparently from a drug overdose. Sarah's scream echoed through the entire cell block. Emma had never used drugs in her life. She was a fitness enthusiast who barely drank alcohol and got high on investigative journalism, not narcotics. Her death was as impossible as it was convenient for Sarah's enemies. The official story was that Emma had been struggling with prescription painkillers following a back injury. The police found enough oxycodone in her system to kill a horse, along with a suicide note confessing to depression over her failed career. Sarah knew it was all lies. Emma had been murdered to silence her investigation, and Sarah's last ally was gone. As she sat in her cell, staring at the concrete walls that seemed to be closing in around her, Sarah realized the full scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about a stolen watch or a jealous employee. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to destroy her life completely. Victoria Sterling hadn't just stolen a watch. She had stolen Sarah's freedom, her marriage, her reputation, and now her best friend's life. And Sarah was powerless to stop her. The baby kicked suddenly, hard enough to make Sarah gasp. She placed her hand on her belly and felt the tiny life struggling inside her. "I won't let them win," she whispered. "I promise you, baby. Mommy will find a way to fight back." But as the jail settled into its nighttime quiet, Sarah wondered if she was making a promise she could never keep. 2 months later, Sarah's trial began with the efficiency of a machine designed to destroy lives. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Walsh, painted Sarah as a cold, calculating gold digger who had preyed on a grieving widower's trust. Marcus had lost his first wife to cancer 3 years before meeting Sarah, a detail that hadn't been widely known, but now became central to the prosecution's narrative. Sarah was portrayed as a manipulative woman who had exploited Marcus's vulnerability to gain access to his fortune. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," DA Walsh said during opening statements, "the defendant saw an opportunity and took it. She married a man still mourning his first wife, gained his trust, and when she became pregnant, she saw her chance to secure her future by stealing a priceless family heirloom." Sarah's new court-appointed lawyer, a tired-looking man named Robert Fletcher, seemed overwhelmed from the start. His opening statement was brief and unconvincing, focusing mainly on reasonable doubt, rather than presenting an alternative theory of the crime. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented the security footage showing Sarah entering the vault, the biometric data confirming her access, and the discovery of the watch in her prenatal vitamins. They called witnesses who testified about Sarah's modest background in student loan debt, painting her as someone with clear financial motive. But the most damaging testimony came from Victoria Sterling herself. Victoria took the stand wearing a conservative navy suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her manner professional and credible. She spoke about her FBI background, her role in Blackstone Industries security, and her reluctance to believe that Sarah could be capable of such betrayal. "I like Mrs. Blackstone," Victoria testified, her voice carrying just the right note of sadness. "I wanted to be wrong about her, but the evidence was overwhelming." Under cross-examination, Fletcher failed to land any meaningful blows. Victoria smoothly deflected questions about the security system's vulnerabilities and her own access to the vault. When Fletcher suggested that someone else could have planted the watch, Victoria's response was devastating. "Mr. Fletcher, I've spent 15 years in law enforcement and private security. I know how to follow evidence wherever it leads. The evidence in this case leads directly to your client." Sarah watched the jury during Victoria's testimony and saw her future in their faces. They believed every word the polished former FBI agent said. To them, Victoria was credible authority, while Sarah was just another criminal trying to avoid responsibility. The trial lasted 6 days. Sarah's defense was minimal. Fletcher called no expert witnesses to challenge the digital evidence, presented no alternative theories, and seemed more interested in plea bargaining than fighting for his client's innocence. When the guilty verdict came back, Sarah felt something inside her break permanently. As the judge sentenced her to 7 years in state prison, she placed both hands on her belly and whispered an apology to her unborn child. "I'm sorry, baby. Mommy tried." Central California Women's Facility was everything Sarah's nightmares had warned her it would be. The intake process was dehumanizing. Stripped, searched, issued shapeless gray uniforms, and assigned to a cell that was smaller than her former walk-in closet. Her cellmate was a woman named Rosa Martinez, serving 15 years for armed robbery. Rosa was tough, streetwise and initially suspicious of the rich girl who had been sent to share her space. "You the one married to that tech guy?" Rosa asked on Sarah's first night, studying her from the opposite bunk. Sarah nodded, too exhausted and heartbroken to pretend otherwise. "Heard you stole from him. That true?" "No," Sarah said simply. "Someone framed me." Rosa snorted. "Everyone in here is innocent, princess. You better figure out how to survive in here fast, 'cause your husband ain't coming to save you." Rosa was right about survival being the priority. Prison was a world with its own rules, hierarchies, and dangers. Sarah's pregnancy made her vulnerable, and her high-profile case made her a target. Other inmates saw her as either a weak mark to be exploited or a symbol of privilege to be torn down. The first attack came 3 weeks into her sentence. Sarah was in the library trying to research legal precedents for her appeal when 3 women surrounded her table. "Look what we got here," said their leader, a heavily tattooed woman named Crystal. "The baby thief." "I didn't steal anything," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from her book. Crystal slammed her hand down on the table. "You calling the court wrong? You saying you better than the rest of us?" Before Sarah could respond, Crystal grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. "Time you learned some respect." What happened next was a blur of violence and terror. Sarah curled into a ball, trying to protect her belly as kicks and punches rained down on her back and shoulders. She could hear other inmates shouting, guards blowing whistles, the thunder of running feet. Then suddenly the attack stopped. "Back off!" a voice roared. "All of you, get back!" Sarah looked up through swollen eyes to see a large African-American woman standing over her, her presence alone enough to scatter the attackers. This was Maria Washington, a lifer who commanded respect throughout the prison. "You okay?" Maria asked, helping Sarah to her feet. Sarah nodded, though she was anything but okay. Her ribs ached, her face was bruised, and she was terrified for her baby. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked. Maria studied her for a moment. "I got kids on the outside, grandkids too. Maybe you did what they say you did. Maybe you didn't. But that baby you carrying ain't done nothing wrong." From that day forward, Maria became Sarah's protector and teacher. She explained the unwritten rules of prison survival. Keep your head down, don't make enemies, find allies where you can, and never show weakness. "You gotta be smart in here," Maria explained during one of their conversations in the prison yard. "You ain't tough enough to fight your way through 7 years, so you gotta think your way through." But Sarah's thinking was increasingly clouded by the stress and poor conditions of prison life. The food was barely edible, the medical care minimal, and the constant fear was wearing her down physically and mentally. At 8 months pregnant, the inevitable happened. Sarah woke one morning to intense cramping and the feeling of fluid between her legs. Rosa took one look at her and started shouting for the guards. "Medical emergency! We need medical right now!" The trip to the prison infirmary was a nightmare of pain and terror. Sarah was in active labor, but something was wrong. The baby was coming too early, and the prison medical staff seemed unprepared for complications. "Please," Sarah begged the prison doctor, a tired-looking man who seemed more interested in his clipboard than her emergency. "Something's wrong. The pain is too intense." First babies are always difficult," he said dismissively. "You'll be fine." But Sarah wasn't fine. Hours passed in agony as her labor progressed without proper pain management or monitoring. The prison infirmary was understaffed and under-equipped for obstetric emergencies. When her son was finally born, he was small, blue, and not breathing. Sarah's screams echoed through the prison as medical staff worked frantically to resuscitate her baby. For 10 minutes, the longest 10 minutes of her life, she didn't know if her child would live or die. When the baby finally drew his first breath, Sarah broke down completely. All the stress, fear, and trauma of the past months poured out of her in gasping sobs. Her son weighed only 4 pounds, born 6 weeks premature due to the stress of her imprisonment. He would need to be transferred to a real hospital's NICU, which meant Sarah would be separated from him immediately. As they prepared to take her baby away, Sarah held him for the first and last time in weeks. He was so small, so fragile, with Marcus's dark hair and her own stubborn chin. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her son. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." The baby was taken to Los Angeles Children's Hospital, while Sarah was returned to her cell to recover alone. She was allowed to pump breast milk that would be transported to the hospital, but she couldn't hold her son, couldn't comfort him, couldn't be the mother he needed. 3 weeks later, the final blow came in the form of legal papers delivered by a prison guard. Marcus was filing for divorce and seeking full custody of their son, who had been named Marcus Jr. without Sarah's input. The petition painted Sarah as an unfit mother whose criminal actions had endangered their child. It requested that her parental rights be terminated completely. Sarah sat on her prison cot, holding the papers in her shaking hands, and realized that Victoria Sterling had accomplished something beyond mere theft. She had stolen Sarah's entire life, her freedom, her marriage, her reputation, and now her child. Outside her cell window, she could see other inmates in the prison yard, some playing basketball, others just walking in circles. They seemed to accept their fate, but Sarah wouldn't. Her son was out there somewhere, growing up without her, and Sarah refused to let Victoria Sterling's lies define the rest of their lives. She began to plan. 6 months after giving birth in prison, Sarah sat in the visiting room, staring at divorce papers while her court-appointed family attorney explained the hopelessness of her situation. "Mrs. Blackstone, I have to be honest with you," said the lawyer, a well-meaning woman named Janet Morrison, who was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of Sarah's case. "Your husband has unlimited resources and you're a convicted felon. The courts will almost certainly award him full custody." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photographs Marcus's attorneys had submitted as evidence. Pictures of her son, Marcus Jr., showed a healthy, happy baby being held by Marcus and Victoria. In the photos, Victoria looked like a perfect mother figure, her blonde hair soft around her shoulders, her smile warm and natural. "He's calling her mommy," Janet continued gently. "Your son doesn't remember you, Sarah. He was only with you for a few hours after birth." Each word was a knife to Sarah's heart. She studied the photographs, memorizing every detail of her child's face. He had grown so much in 6 months, and she had missed everything. His first smile, his first laugh, probably his first attempts to crawl. "What about visitation rights?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from Janet's expression. "Given your conviction and the nature of the crime, the court is unlikely to grant meaningful visitation. Maybe supervised visits once you're released, but that's still over 6 years away." Sarah set down the photographs and stared at her hands. In the early days of her imprisonment, she had clung to the hope that somehow the truth would emerge, that someone would discover Victoria's deception. But months had passed with no revelation, no dramatic courtroom reversal, no vindication. The reality was simple and brutal. Victoria Sterling had won completely. That night, Sarah lay on her narrow cot listening to Rosa snore in the bunk below. Through the small window, she could see stars barely visible through the prison's floodlights. Somewhere under those same stars, her son was sleeping in a nursery she had never seen, being comforted by a woman who had destroyed his real mother's life. The thought of Victoria reading bedtime stories to Marcus Jr., Anu of Victoria being there for his first words and first steps, was unbearable. Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open, releasing all the despair she had been holding back. She began to cry, and once she started, she couldn't stop. Her sobs woke Rosa, who climbed up to Sarah's bunk without saying a word. The tough woman who had initially treated Sarah with suspicion now wrapped her arms around her cellmate and let her cry. "They're gonna take my baby permanently," Sarah whispered through her tears. "He won't even remember me." Rosa held her tighter. "Hey, listen to me. You can't give up. Kids need their real mothers, even if they don't know it yet." But Sarah felt hollowed out, emptied of everything that had once made her fight. The woman who had once been an investigative journalist, who had built her career on exposing corruption and seeking truth, felt completely powerless. The next morning brought another devastating blow. During breakfast, Sarah overheard two other inmates discussing a news story they had seen on television. "That tech billionaire got married again," one of them said. "Real fancy wedding in Malibu. His new wife is some former FBI agent or something." Sarah's spoon clattered to the floor. She felt the blood drain from her face as the implication hit her. Marcus and Victoria had married, making Victoria legally Marcus Jr.'s stepmother. The woman who had framed Sarah was now raising her child. Sarah excused herself from breakfast and ran to the bathroom, where she vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach. When she looked up, Maria Washington was standing in the doorway. "Heard about the wedding," Maria said simply. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "You gonna let her win?" The question hit Sarah like a slap. She looked up at Maria, this woman who had become her unexpected guardian angel. "What choice do I have? She's got everything. My husband, my child, my freedom. She's won." Maria crossed her arms and fixed Sarah with a stern look. "You know what your problem is? You thinking like a victim instead of like a survivor. That woman may have taken your life, but she ain't taken your brain." "My brain isn't going to get me out of here, Maria." "Maybe not, but it might help you figure out how to get your son back eventually. You was a reporter, right? You know how to investigate, how to find truth. Maybe it's time you started using those skills." That afternoon, Sarah sat in the prison library with a legal pad, trying to organize her thoughts. Maria was right. She had been thinking like a victim instead of like the investigative journalist she had once been. She began to list everything she knew about Victoria Sterling and the night the watch was stolen. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of her old self returning. She might be trapped in prison, but her mind was still free. And if Victoria had framed her, there had to be evidence of the deception somewhere. She began with what she remembered about the security system. Marcus had always been paranoid about digital security, constantly updating and upgrading their home's defenses. But every system had vulnerabilities, and Victoria would have needed to exploit them to plant the fake evidence. Sarah wrote down everything she could remember about the timeline, when she had supposedly entered the vault according to the biometric records, what she had actually been doing that night, who had access to the security system, and how the watch had been discovered. As she worked, a memory surfaced that made her pause. The night before the watch was discovered, she had taken a sleeping pill because of pregnancy insomnia. She remembered Marcus taking one too, saying he had an important call with Tokyo investors early the next morning. But if Marcus had taken a sleeping pill, how could he have been awake for a call with Tokyo? The time difference meant the call would have been in the middle of the night, California time. Sarah wrote down this discrepancy, along with several others she was beginning to remember. Victoria's too convenient discovery of the watch, her immediate assumption that it was theft rather than misplacement, her expert guidance of the police investigation. For the first time since her arrest, Sarah felt something other than despair. She felt anger, and anger was an emotion she could use. She began requesting legal books from the prison library, studying everything she could about digital evidence, security systems, and wrongful conviction cases. If Victoria thought she had destroyed Sarah Mitchell completely, she was about to learn that Sarah Mitchell Blackstone was far from finished. Rosa noticed the change immediately. "You look different," she observed one evening as Sarah pored over case law. "I feel different," Sarah admitted. "I'm done being a victim." "About time," Rosa said with approval. "Prison ain't no place for victims." Sarah looked up from her books and met Rosa's eyes. "I'm going to prove my innocence. And when I do, Victoria Sterling is going to pay for what she's done to me and my son." It was a bold statement from a woman serving 7 years for grand theft. But Rosa had learned not to underestimate her cellmate. Sarah Mitchell might have been beaten down, but she wasn't beaten completely. And sometimes that was all the difference between survival and surrender. 2 years into her sentence, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Detective Ray Cooper, the same man who had arrested her, sat across from her in the prison visiting room, looking older and troubled. "Mrs. Blackstone," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I wanted to talk to you about your case." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of his intentions. Detective Cooper had been professional during her arrest, even kind, but he had still put her in handcuffs. "What about it?" she asked cautiously. Cooper leaned forward, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I've been having second thoughts. Some things about your case never sat right with me." Sarah felt her heart begin to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What kinds of things?" The biometric evidence was too clean, too perfect. In 20 years of police work, I've never seen a case where every piece of evidence pointed in exactly the same direction without any contradictions. Cooper opened a manila folder and slid several photographs across the table. "I had a computer expert take a fresh look at the security footage. There are anomalies in the digital signature that suggest the files may have been altered. Sarah stared at the technical analysis, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. You think the footage was faked? I think it's possible. And if it was, that means someone with serious technical expertise framed you. Cooper met her eyes. Someone like Victoria Sterling. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt hope stirring in her chest. What can we do about it? Cooper's expression grew grim. That's the problem. I took my concerns to my captain in the district attorney's office. They told me the case was closed and I should focus on new investigations. They don't want to hear it? Mrs. Blackstone, your husband is one of the most powerful men in California. His new wife is a former federal agent with connections throughout law enforcement. Nobody wants to suggest that they might have been wrong about your guilt. Sarah felt the familiar crushing weight of powerlessness descending on her again. Even with a detective on her side, the system seemed determined to keep her buried. But, Cooper continued, I'm retiring in 6 months. After that, I'll have more freedom to look into things that interest me. He stood to leave, then turned back. Your friend Emma Rodriguez was a good reporter. Before she died, she had started asking some very interesting questions about Victoria Sterling's background. Sarah's breath caught. What kind of questions? The kind that got her killed, Cooper said quietly. Be careful, Mrs. Blackstone. Whatever you're up against, it's bigger and more dangerous than you know. After Cooper left, Sarah sat alone in the visiting room, processing what she had learned. Someone in law enforcement believed her story, but even he was afraid to act on it while he was still active duty. She thought about Emma, whose death had been ruled a drug overdose despite her friend's clean lifestyle. If Cooper was right, Emma had been murdered for getting too close to the truth about Victoria Sterling. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about her son, now 2 years old and walking and talking. In the latest photographs Marcus's lawyers had provided, Marcus Jr. looked happy and healthy, playing in a beautiful backyard with a golden retriever puppy. Victoria was in several of the photos, looking every inch the devoted mother. She had cut her hair shorter, softened her appearance, and seemed to have completely transformed herself from the cold, calculating woman Sarah remembered. But Sarah knew the truth. Victoria Sterling was a killer who had stolen a life and destroyed a family to get what she wanted, and somehow Sarah was going to prove it. The next day, she was surprised to receive another visitor. A young woman with red hair and freckles introduced herself as Amanda Foster, a journalist with the Los Angeles Weekly. I've been investigating wrongful conviction cases, Amanda explained, and yours caught my attention. I knew Emma Rodriguez. She was my mentor when I was starting out. Before she died, she told me she was working on something big involving a tech billionaire's wife. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Emma never mentioned working on my case. She was being careful, too careful, as it turned out. Amanda leaned forward. Mrs. Blackstone, I think Emma was murdered because she discovered something about Victoria Sterling that someone didn't want revealed. What kind of something? Amanda glanced around the visiting room nervously. I can't say here, but I can tell you that Victoria Sterling's background isn't what it appears to be. Her FBI career ended under very suspicious circumstances, and there are gaps in her employment history that don't add up. Before Sarah could respond, Amanda slid a piece of paper across the table. This is my card. When you get out of here, call me. I think together we might be able to prove your innocence. After Amanda left, Sarah stared at the business card in her hands. 2 people now believed her story. It wasn't much, but it was more hope than she had felt in months. That evening, as she worked in the prison library, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She couldn't investigate from inside prison, but she could prepare for when she eventually got out. She began studying everything she could about digital forensics, corporate security, and criminal law. Rosa watched her transformation with approval. You're turning into someone different, she observed one night. Harder, smarter. I have to, Sarah replied. My son needs me to be strong enough to fight for him. What you gonna do when you get out? Sarah looked up from her legal books. I'm going to destroy the woman who destroyed my life, and I'm going to get my son back. It was a bold declaration from a woman still facing 5 more years in prison. But Sarah Mitchell had learned that survival sometimes required believing in impossible things. And proving Victoria Sterling was a fraud seemed less impossible every day. 3 months later, Sarah received news that changed everything. Marcus Blackstone had died in a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. His Porsche had gone off a cliff during a late-night drive, killing him instantly. The funeral was massive, attended by tech industry leaders, politicians, and celebrities. Sarah watched the coverage on the prison television, studying every face in the crowd. Victoria, now a widow at 34, inherited everything. Blackstone Industries, the mansion, the art collection, in legal custody of Marcus Jr. But something in Victoria's behavior at the funeral caught Sarah's attention. The woman who had once been Marcus's devoted security chief and wife seemed almost relieved rather than grief-stricken. Her tears appeared staged, her mourning performance perfect but hollow. Sarah began to wonder if Marcus's death had really been an accident, and if it hadn't been, she now understood exactly how dangerous Victoria Sterling truly was. The woman who had framed Sarah wasn't just a thief, she was potentially a murderer who would stop at nothing to protect her stolen life. Detective Ray Cooper's retirement party was a modest affair at a downtown Los Angeles bar, attended by fellow officers and their families. He had served the LAPD for 25 years with distinction, earning commendations for his work on dozens of high-profile cases. But the case that haunted him most was the one everyone considered closed, the theft conviction of Sarah Mitchell Blackstone. 2 weeks after his retirement became official, Cooper sat in his home office surrounded by boxes of files, photographs, and evidence that he had quietly copied before leaving the department. The Sarah Blackstone case occupied an entire wall, a complex web of connections and inconsistencies that had grown more troubling with time. Marcus Blackstone's death 6 months earlier had bothered Cooper from the beginning. Single-car accidents on the PCH weren't uncommon, but the circumstances of this particular crash raised questions. Marcus had been driving at nearly midnight on a Tuesday, supposedly returning from a business dinner that Cooper couldn't verify had actually taken place. More suspicious was Victoria Sterling's reaction to her husband's death. Cooper had attended the funeral and watched her carefully. Her grief seemed performative, precisely calibrated for public consumption. She had inherited everything: a multi-billion-dollar company, prime real estate, and custody of a 3-year-old boy who would someday inherit even more. Cooper opened his laptop and began typing. He had spent months quietly investigating Victoria Sterling's background, using contacts in federal law enforcement and private databases. What he had discovered was disturbing. Victoria Sterling had indeed been an FBI agent, but her departure from the Bureau was far from voluntary. She had been under investigation for evidence tampering in a major financial fraud case when she suddenly resigned. The investigation was quietly dropped, but Cooper's sources confirmed that Victoria had been on the verge of criminal charges. Even more interesting was what Cooper had learned about Victoria's family background. Born Victoria Blackstone, she was the illegitimate daughter of Marcus's father, making her Marcus's half-sister. The family connection had been carefully hidden. Victoria had taken her mother's maiden name and had no official relationship with the Blackstone family. But Cooper had found birth records, DNA evidence from a paternity suit that had been sealed by court order, and financial records showing payments from the elder Blackstone to Victoria's mother for 20 years. The motive was becoming clear. Victoria hadn't just wanted Marcus's money, she had wanted what she saw as her rightful inheritance. As the illegitimate child, she had been excluded from the family fortune while Marcus inherited everything. Sarah's marriage to Marcus had threatened Victoria's long-term plan to eventually claim her place in the Blackstone dynasty. Cooper's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Amanda Foster, the journalist who had been investigating wrongful conviction cases. "Detective Cooper, I have something you need to see." They met an hour later at a coffee shop in downtown LA. Amanda slid a flash drive across the table, along with several printed documents. "I've been investigating Victoria Sterling for 8 months," Amanda explained. "I found the connection between her and Marcus. They're half-siblings. But that's not the most important thing I discovered." Cooper plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The screen filled with technical documentation, financial records, and what appeared to be communications between Victoria and a private cybersecurity firm. 6 months before the watch was stolen, Victoria hired a company called Digital Solutions Inc. to conduct security testing on the Blackstone Mansion systems. Amanda continued. The contract specifically mentioned testing the biometric security on the vault. Cooper studied the documentation. She was learning how to hack her own employer's security system. Exactly, and look at this. Amanda pointed to another document. 3 weeks before Sarah's arrest, Victoria purchased specialized software designed for creating fake biometric data. The same software was used to generate the false evidence showing Sarah accessing the vault. Cooper felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She had months to plan this. She studied the security system, created the fake evidence, and waited for the perfect opportunity. Sarah's pregnancy gave her that opportunity. A pregnant woman would be seen as desperate to secure her child's future, making the theft charge more believable. Cooper continued reading through Amanda's research. The evidence was overwhelming. Purchase orders for replica watches, communications with the company that had created the fake Lincoln timepiece, and financial records showing payments to Detective Martinez, Cooper's former partner, who had since transferred to another department. Martinez was paid off? Cooper asked, his voice tight with anger. Amanda nodded. $50,000 deposited into an offshore account registered to his wife's maiden name. Victoria bought herself a cooperative investigator to help build the case against Sarah. Cooper sat back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Victoria Sterling hadn't just framed Sarah. She had corrupted a police investigation and possibly committed murder to cover her tracks. What about Emma Rodriguez? Cooper asked. Amanda's expression darkened. I found evidence that Victoria hired a private investigator to monitor Emma's activities. The day before Emma died, she had accessed financial records that would have exposed Victoria's payments to Detective Martinez. So Emma was murdered to keep her quiet. I believe so, and I think Marcus was killed for the same reason. Victoria needed him dead to gain complete control of his fortune and custody of Marcus Jr. Cooper closed the laptop and looked at Amanda. This is enough to reopen Sarah's case and probably charge Victoria with murder. But we need to be careful. If Victoria is willing to kill to protect her secret, neither of us is safe. Amanda leaned forward. Detective, Sarah Blackstone has been in prison for 3 years for a crime she didn't commit. Her son doesn't even remember her. We have to take the risk. Cooper nodded grimly. You're right, but we do this smart. I still have friends in the DA's office who weren't involved in the original case. We present everything at once with enough evidence that they can't ignore it. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Amanda asked the question that had been haunting both of them. What if Victoria realizes what we're doing? Cooper's hand moved instinctively to the concealed weapon he still carried, despite his retirement. Then we'd better move fast. They had no idea that across the street, a man with a telephoto lens had been photographing their meeting. Within an hour, the photos would be on Victoria Sterling's desk, along with a detailed report of their investigation. The race to expose the truth had begun, and Sarah's life hung in the balance. Victoria Sterling sat in Marcus's former office, now hers, studying the surveillance photos with the calm calculation that had served her so well over the years. Detective Cooper and the journalist had uncovered more than she had expected, but not more than she could handle. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in months. It's me, she said when the call was answered. We have a problem that needs to be resolved. Permanently. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Sarah jolted awake in her prison cell to the sound of a guard's voice calling her name through the bars. Blackstone! Warden wants to see you. Now! Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the guard through the dark corridors of the prison. Emergency meetings with the warden were never good news, and at 3 in the morning, they usually meant someone was dead. Warden Patricia Chen was waiting in her office along with 2 people Sarah didn't recognize. A middle-aged woman in an expensive suit and a younger man with a briefcase. Sit down, Mrs. Blackstone, the warden said, her voice unusually gentle. These are attorneys from the California Innocence Project. They have some news for you. The woman in the suit leaned forward. Mrs. Blackstone, my name is Catherine Webb. I'm here to inform you that based on new evidence, all charges against you have been dropped. You're being released immediately. Sarah stared at her, unable to process the words. What do you mean, released? Victoria Sterling has been arrested for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and murder, Webb continued. We have compelling evidence that she framed you for the watch theft and killed at least 2 people to cover up her crimes. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. After 3 years in prison, the concept of freedom felt unreal, impossible to grasp. "My son," she whispered. "What about Marcus Jr.?" Webb's expression softened. "He's safe. He's currently in protective custody while the courts determine permanent placement. You'll have the opportunity to petition for custody as soon as you're settled." An hour later, Sarah walked through the prison gates carrying a paper bag containing her few possessions. Amanda Foster was waiting for her, along with Detective Cooper and a small crowd of reporters. "Sarah," Amanda called out, "how does it feel to be free?" Sarah looked around at the photographers and news cameras, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. For 3 years, her world had been concrete walls and metal bars. Now she was expected to speak coherently about justice and vindication. "I just want to see my son," she said simply. The story of Sarah's exoneration and Victoria's arrest dominated the news cycle for weeks. Victoria Sterling, the former FBI agent who had seemed so credible and professional, was revealed to be a master manipulator who had orchestrated one of the most elaborate frame jobs in California legal history. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming. Detective Cooper and Amanda Foster had uncovered not just proof of the frame-up, but evidence linking Victoria to the deaths of Emma Rodriguez and Marcus Blackstone. Phone records showed Victoria had been in contact with known criminals in the days before both deaths, and financial records revealed payments that corresponded to the timing of the murders. Most damning of all was Victoria's confession, recorded during a confrontation with Cooper and Amanda at Blackstone Industries headquarters. Believing she was speaking to corrupt associates, Victoria had detailed her entire plan, from discovering her biological relationship to Marcus, to framing Sarah, to eventually murdering Marcus for his inheritance. "I gave Marcus everything," Victoria was heard saying on the recording. 10 years of my life, my expertise, my loyalty, and he gave it all to some nobody he'd known for 6 months. Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be temporary, a rebound after his first wife died. When she got pregnant, I realized she was going to take everything that should have been mine." The confession continued with chilling detail about how Victoria had studied the security system, created the fake evidence, and manipulated the investigation. She described Emma's murder as unfortunate but necessary, and Marcus's death as the natural conclusion to the plan. Victoria Sterling was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and a dozen other felonies. She would likely spend the rest of her life in prison, the same prison where Sarah had spent 3 years for crimes Victoria had committed. But for Sarah, vindication felt hollow. She had lost 3 years of her life and nearly all of her son's early childhood. Marcus Jr., now 4 years old, didn't remember her. To him, Victoria had been his mother, and Sarah was a stranger claiming to be someone important. The reunion took place in a family court office, supervised by social workers and psychologists. Sarah sat on a small chair designed for children, trying to connect with the boy who looked so much like Marcus, but didn't know who she was. "Hello, sweetie," Sarah said softly. "I'm your mommy." Marcus Jr. hid behind the social worker, peeking out at Sarah with Marcus's dark eyes. He was beautiful, healthy, and completely terrified of her. "Where's Mama Victoria?" he asked, his voice small and confused. The question broke Sarah's heart. Victoria, the woman who had destroyed their family, was the only mother this little boy remembered. Despite everything Victoria had done, she had apparently been loving and attentive to Marcus Jr., making the transition even more traumatic for him. "She can't be here right now," the social worker explained gently. "But Sarah is your first mommy, from when you were a baby. She loves you very much." It would take months of supervised visits, family therapy, and patient rebuilding before Marcus Jr. began to accept Sarah as his mother. The process was heartbreaking, watching her son grieve for the woman who had stolen him while struggling to bond with his real mother. Sarah's lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, and Blackstone Industries eventually resulted in a settlement of $50 million. The money was substantial, but it couldn't buy back the years she had lost or repair the psychological damage done to both her and her son. She used part of the settlement to establish the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals prove their innocence. The foundation also provided support for the children of incarcerated parents, recognizing that crimes against parents inevitably harm their children as well. Detective Cooper became the Foundation's chief investigator, finally able to pursue the kind of thorough, unbiased investigations that had been impossible within the constraints of the police department. Amanda Foster left journalism to become the Foundation's communications director, ensuring that stories like Sarah's received the attention they deserved. Victoria Sterling's trial was a media sensation. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating sociopath who had destroyed multiple lives in pursuit of wealth and power. Her defense team tried to argue that she had been mentally unstable due to the trauma of being rejected by her biological father, but the evidence of her careful planning and manipulation made the insanity defense impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria Sterling was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Victoria showed no emotion. She sat straight in her chair, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression as cold and controlled as ever. Only when she was led away in handcuffs did she look back at Sarah, who had attended every day of the trial. Their eyes met for a moment across the courtroom, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Not remorse, but a kind of bitter satisfaction. Even facing life in prison, Victoria seemed to believe that her actions had been justified. Sarah looked away first. Victoria Sterling no longer had power over her life, and Sarah refused to give her even the satisfaction of a prolonged stare. 2 years after her exoneration, Sarah stood in the backyard of her new home in Pasadena, watching Marcus Jr., who now insisted on being called Michael, play with their golden retriever, Justice. At 6 years old, Michael was beginning to look less like his father and more like himself, a unique combination of Sarah's stubborn determination and Marcus's quick intelligence. The house was modest compared to the Blackstone mansion, but it felt like home in a way the penthouse never had. Sarah had chosen it specifically for the large backyard where Michael could play safely, far from the media attention that still occasionally followed their story. "Mom, watch this!" Michael called out, attempting to teach Justice to fetch a frisbee that was almost as big as he was. "I'm watching, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her heart still catching a little every time he called her mom. It had taken 18 months of family therapy and patient rebuilding, but Michael had finally accepted her as his mother. The transition hadn't been easy. He had grieved for Victoria, been confused and angry about the changes in his life, and struggled to understand why adults he trusted had lied to him. But children were resilient in ways that amazed Sarah. With the help of skilled therapists and a lot of love, Michael had begun to heal from the trauma of his early childhood. He would always carry some scars from the experience, but he was learning to trust again. Amanda Foster arrived at 6 o'clock for their weekly dinner, a tradition they had started when Sarah first got out of prison. Amanda had become like a sister to Sarah, one of the few people who truly understood what she had endured. "How was the Foundation meeting today?" Amanda asked as they prepared dinner together in Sarah's kitchen. "Good. We're taking on 3 new cases this month," Sarah replied, tossing salad while Amanda grilled chicken on the back deck. "Ray thinks we have a strong chance of proving innocence in at least 2 of them." The Sarah Mitchell Foundation had become one of the most respected innocence organizations in California, with a success rate that surpassed even the established groups. Sarah's experience as both an investigative journalist and a wrongfully convicted person gave her unique insight into the flaws in the criminal justice system. "Any word on Victoria's appeal?" Amanda asked, though she already knew the answer would be negative. "Denied again. Her legal team is running out of options." Sarah's voice was neutral when discussing Victoria, a hard-won emotional detachment that had taken years to achieve. Victoria Sterling remained in maximum security prison, her appeals consistently rejected by higher courts. Occasionally, reporters would interview her, and she would claim that she was the real victim, that Marcus had promised to marry her and then betrayed her for Sarah. She showed no remorse for her crimes and continued to insist that her actions had been justified. Sarah no longer read these interviews or followed news about Victoria. The woman who had stolen 3 years of her life no longer deserved even that much attention. After dinner, Sarah tucked Michael into bed and read him a story about a brave knight rescuing a dragon. It was his current favorite, a tale that reversed traditional roles and showed that sometimes the monsters needed saving too. "Mom, was the bad lady really sick in her brain?" Michael asked as Sarah closed the book. He had recently begun asking more sophisticated questions about his early childhood and the circumstances that had separated him from Sarah. Sarah considered her answer carefully. The therapist had advised honesty appropriate to his age level, helping Michael understand what had happened without traumatizing him further. She was sick in a way that made her hurt other people, Sarah said. But that doesn't mean what she did was okay. Sometimes people make bad choices even when they know better. Michael nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that characterized many of his conversations about difficult topics. "I'm glad you came back," he said, wrapping his arms around Sarah's neck. "I'm glad too, baby. I'm never going anywhere again." As Sarah turned off Michael's light and closed his door, she reflected on how different her life had become from what she had once imagined. She would never have the fairy tale marriage or the financial security she had briefly experienced as Marcus Blackstone's wife. But she had something more valuable: genuine peace and the knowledge that she had survived the worst thing that could happen to her and found a way to help others survive similar ordeals. Her phone rang as she settled into her home office to review case files for the foundation. The caller ID showed Detective Cooper's number. "Ray, what's up?" "Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up. Victoria Sterling was found dead in her cell this morning." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: surprise, relief, and something that might have been sadness for the wasted potential of a brilliant woman who had chosen destruction over creation. "What happened?" "Apparent suicide. She hanged herself with bed sheets, left a note, but it didn't contain any apologies or admissions of guilt. Just more of her justifications and blame." After hanging up, Sarah sat quietly in her office, processing this final chapter in Victoria's story. She felt no satisfaction in Victoria's death, only a kind of closure. The woman who had haunted her nightmares for years was gone, and with her went the last shadow over Sarah's new life. She looked at the framed photo on her desk: Michael blowing out candles on his 6th birthday cake, his face bright with joy and innocence. Beside it was another photo: Sarah receiving an award from the California Bar Association for her foundation's work on behalf of the wrongfully convicted. These were her victories now, not the vindication of being proven right or the satisfaction of seeing her enemy punished, but the quiet triumphs of rebuilding a life and helping others rebuild theirs. Victoria Sterling had taken 3 years from Sarah, but she had also inadvertently given her a purpose larger than any she might have found in her original life. The Sarah who had been content to be a billionaire's wife would never have started a foundation or fought for justice for others. The woman who had survived prison and fought for her son was capable of far more than her younger self had ever imagined. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Sarah paused at Michael's door, listening to his quiet breathing. Tomorrow she would tell him that the woman who had raised him for his first few years was gone, and they would work through whatever complex emotions that news brought up. But tonight, she would simply be grateful for the life they had built together, imperfect and hard-won though it was. The golden cage of her first marriage had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable: freedom, truth, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Victoria Sterling had tried to steal everything from Sarah Mitchell. In the end, she had only made Sarah stronger. 5 years later, Michael Mitchell celebrated his 11th birthday with friends from his soccer team and classmates from his private school. He was a confident, happy child who excelled academically and showed natural leadership skills that reminded Sarah of the best parts of his father. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation had helped exonerate 43 wrongfully convicted individuals, reuniting families and exposing corruption throughout the California criminal justice system. Sarah had testified before Congress about the need for criminal justice reform and had been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of their heroes of justice. She never remarried, finding fulfillment in her work and her role as Michael's mother. Sometimes reporters would ask if she was bitter about the years she had lost, and Sarah would always give the same answer: "I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing you ever do. I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone, but I wouldn't trade the life I've built because of it." The golden cage had been real, but so was her escape from it. And in the end, freedom was worth every struggle it had cost her. Sarah's story proves that sometimes the worst betrayal comes from those we trust most, but it also shows that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what shocked you most about Victoria's deception. Share this with someone who needs to hear Sarah's message about resilience and never giving up on the truth. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because there are more incredible true stories of survival, betrayal, and justice coming your way. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.